Well, welcome to our panel, everybody. Me again, Moletsane. Our panel is titled Local Worlds / Global Foodways and Foodscapes. And I'll be facilitating the sessions today. We are in for a treat. We've got three wonderful speakers. I'll introduce them as they come up the stage. First, we have Rashida Adum-Atta from Leiden University. I understand she's a PhD candidate at Leiden University, speaking on negotiating the presence of pig trotter in Madina Zongo. Over to you, Rashida.
Good afternoon, everyone. If you can hear me. And my name is Rashida. Perfectly. Let me be sure everybody can hear me and see my screen.
We can hear you.
Okay, that's good. My name is Rashida Al-Hassan, and like she rightly said, I'm a PhD candidate at Leiden. This afternoon, I'm presenting on disgust or contamination, negotiating the presence of trotters, pig trotters at Madina Zongo. So for the outline, quickly, I'll be looking at Madina Zongo, Madina Market, contamination or disgust, briefly talk about trotters as a matter
Excuse me, Rashida. Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but we can't see your presentation. We can see your screen though, but not your presentation.
Okay. Can you see it now? Can you see anything, please?
We can see your screen. Unless I'm wrong, somebody out there, unless it's me from this.
No, we can just see your screen.
No, you're not wrong. We can see your screen. So, Rashida, if you can just drop your share, please. So stop sharing.
Okay.
Okay, and let's try again.
Okay. Okay, let me go it this way. I don't know, does this work out? Do you see my
right?
Yeah,
that's right. Go into presentation mode.
Okay.
And then just click hide.
There we go. Thank you.
Oh. No. I think once I put the hide, it stops. So please bear with me as you go with the hide.
No problem.
Okay. So like I briefly said, so this is the quick outline. I'm losing time, so let me rush. So for the start, I want to explain what a Zongo is. So the Zongo, it's a Hausa term. Hausa is a language known to most West African countries, used to describe settlers of foreign traders from North Africa and the Sahara. So these people largely influenced the spread of Islam in Ghana and have often established places in major cities. Several are scattered around Ghana, and Madina Zongo is one of such settlements. This is a picture of a Zongo. This is how it looks like. So it's a suburb in Accra. Accra is Ghana's capital, and it was created in the 1957 with the permission of the Ga Manche. The Ga people are the owners of the land in Accra, Ghana. So Madina, even though has been referred to as the settlers town, 60 years on, over 60 years now, it's one of the biggest residential and commercial centers in the city of Accra. Though it was initially inhabited by Muslims, but now one can say that it's very cosmopolitan now, home to many Muslims, Christians, and even practitioners of indigenous African religion. And in the heart of Madina Zongo is the Madina market. So these are pictures of what really happens on the day-to-day bustling market of Madina. So these are foodstuffs and meats and the other groceries that are sold there. This is how it's a very busy place, like most markets in Accra. And it's crowded with people advertising their wares in several ways. And this is the butcher shop, just to give you an overview of how the meat market looks like. So this is beef, this is chicken, and these are other things, fish and trotters and so on, salted fish. This is how the market looks like. So many interesting names for people shop. Of course, God at the center, religion at the center of it. Efficient shopping arena, Psalm 23 breakfast joint, Hebron prayer camps, and as so many other things depicting the religious state of Madina. So the reason that I chose, or the reason that Madina appears interesting in relation to pig trotters, is that Madina is not the only Zongo in Accra. There are so many other Zongos. We talk of Nima, we talk of Mabobi, we talk of Sabon Kudi. There are so many Zongos. But it's only Madina Zongo, a predominantly Muslim community, that sells pig trotters in its market. Now, the other markets do not have it because people avoid where it's located. So then Madina makes room for other ingredients to coexist, and for that matter, it builds bridges. In another breath, market players also create physical and invisible boundaries due to their own religious taboos and personal reasons. Now, what is the trotter? The trotter is known as a petito, is the culinary term used to refer to the feet of pigs. So trotters are imported into Ghana mainly from Europe. We talk of the Netherlands, we talk of Denmark, Germany, Sweden, and so many other neighboring countries. For so many of these countries, it's waste. It's something that's not eaten. Some do eat it, but not so much. So interlocutors, the people that I interact with, suggest that this is an important, it's a lucrative venture, largely imported into Ghana. And for some of the women, it's a generational occupation. This is from Europe. So these are some of the factories. This is Miss Piki, now known as Orange Top. It's been work sending pig feet to Ghana for over 4 decades. We have one in Sweden called Rosita. We have the Johnny's brand, and the Johnny's brand has even been indigenized, and it's called Obapa. Obapa is a Cree term that means a good woman. And this is how the factory looks like. This is how it's packaged. It's put in brine and packaged mainly. So it depends on the country. So this is the production to Ghana, and this is how it's done. So it's done specifically for your country. This is how it comes in a 60-liter barrel, very heavy. So largely men offloaded from the container. The presence of pig feet in Madina, in fact, provokes some sensational feelings and creates dietary boundaries that are influenced, even though there are personal reasons, but for a lot of people, it's a religious taboo. But what is important is that it is on the market because it's a tasty ingredient and there's a market for it. It's a religious taboo and it's a disgustful ingredient. So I discussed these 3 categories, these 3 narratives. Now, this is the pig feet. It's used for so many meals. It is used for soup, and it has the quality of thickening soups. Not soup. For the indigenous Ghanaian, the soup plays a key role in everyday eating practices. It is used to take alcohol and so much. So it's sold at pubs too for pepper soup. And the second category is that it's a religious taboo. So there are rules contained in Deuteronomy and Leviticus that describes the pig as unclean, and clean animals are permitted as food, whilst unclean animals are prohibited. Now, I delve a little bit into what Mary Douglas presents as a symbolic interpretation of these things. So she describes the pig as not conveniently fitting into the definition of the Israelites' categorization of what a domestic animal should be. So one has the cloven hooves, but it's unable to chew the cud. So for that matter, the only reason it is not to be kept, because you cannot even use the skin for wool, you cannot get milk from it. So these are the religious 10. And for Muslims, it's been in Quran 5:3 that forbidden for you are the dead meat, fresh of swine, and that on which has been invoked the name other than Allah. So all these address the prohibition of swine. Now I look at the third category, looking at the pig trotter as a disgustful ingredient. Now, for a lot of people, the issue of disgust extends even beyond the trotter, seeing the trotter being displayed at the market. But the eater of the trotter, the seller of the trotter, and the buyer of the trotter is in fact disgustful. So you don't have to eat it or buy it or display it. Once you ate or you are standing where it's sold, for a lot of market players, disgust travels within, and that is how one extends this whole discourse of disgust. Now, in gathering field data for this work, this is part of my PhD chapter. I am a Muslim, and I decided to go to the field dressed as a Muslim. And for the first few trotter sellers, they refused to sell to me, indicating that this is something you do not eat. So for that matter, we cannot sell to you. So this is me in the white hijab, in my Angelina dress, attempting to buy. So the lady, in fact, thought I was going to mock her. Prior to this day, I had been there in a blue scarf, in the jeans, and sometimes you're able to buy this unnoticed. So I noticed that, okay, so the dress code plays a key role in my negotiation in trying to buy the pig trotters. So these are onlookers who were trying to find out if I indeed bought the pig trotters. And this is how it's displayed at the market. Because it comes in heavy brine, it doesn't have to be refrigerated. It's put back in the barrel at the end of the day. And it's some of my observations is that it's an occupation for women. It's imported, and Muslims avoid places where it is displayed. And for some of them, they practice techniques, Brian Likens techniques of inattention. They mute their senses when they have to pass it. And Muslims do not rent their stalls to people who intend to sell trotters, because once you come and you want to rent someone's stall, he asks as part of the protocol, what are you going to sell in it? So they do not rent their stalls. And some of the headquarters do not render their services because they are predominantly Muslim, and they see this as an ingredient of contamination. And the municipal assembly there also checks the conditions of it, because due to the humid nature of Ghana, the trotter feet sometimes turns, it's supposed to be pink, but they dye it in order to have a very beautiful color of it. Now, there are myths about the prophets being eaten by the pig. So some of the observations that I made on the field. And for a lot of people, in Mark 5, Jesus cast out demons out of a man, and this is perceived as demonic. And people do not also eat this because of family taboos. The Inzamas, for example, told me that if they want to test if someone has gone for rituals, they would give you money rituals or whatever ritual, they give you pig, and this would kind of there's some conflict between these things. So there are family taboos, and it nullifies the potency of some African powers or charms. So a lot of my interlocutors felt that, okay, maybe you are a researcher, you are doing this, but I was sort of categorized as tamed because of the job I was doing. So people asked, okay, so are you going to do a cleansing ritual? And I was personally challenged to taste it if I was indeed going to do this fully, or this is a research I was doing and I needed to participate fully. So this is how it comes. The pig trotters come in brine, and there's an afterlife of the barrels. The barrels are cleaned and are used as storage cans. It will interest you to know that some of these storage cans travel all the way, and it's used as water cans at mosque. It is used to keep food and is distributed across the country. Other people don't know. Until I started this research, I did not know this is how it comes, because the barrel doesn't say much about pig or trotters. You have to strain your eyes to even know that these are pig trotters. So this is how it travels through the food chain. This is red oil, and like we previously heard from the discussion on plantain, red oil is used for bean stew, and it's a very good combination with plantain. And this is a granite paste, and I saw one container also at the mosque. This was, but the challenge of it is also pointing out to people that this once contained pork also comes with some ethical challenges of doing research, because I just wanted to find out the phenomenon. And this is a Muslim beggar who comes to a pig seller for money, for sadaqah. And they are able to give out, sometimes they give ingredients out. The little boy is holding a bag of ingredients. But the trotter sellers tell me that when they get to their side, they only give them money. They do not give them this ingredient because they know that as a Muslim beggar, he does not eat pork, and they are conscious of that. Thank you. I hope you heard me.
Thank you, Rashida. That was perfect timing. If you could stop share, please.
Okay.
We have about 10 minutes for questions for Rashida, and questions or comments for her. Thank you for a very enriching, fascinating presentations. It links very well with our experiences here of chicken trotters. And even though there are no taboos against it, but linked to your social class, some people thinking that it's only eaten by the poor who can't afford, but other people also thinking that it's a delicacy. So I found the links in your discussions fascinating. Another link that I also was interested in pursuing with you is the taboos against eating pork and eating trotters in particular. And I wondered, in my head, I was linking that to the many taboos that we have in, at least in South African rural communities and other communities around food and women or girls. For example, in some communities, girls cannot eat eggs, or they cannot eat tripe, which is another ingredient that is regarded as disgusting or a delicacy, depending on who you are talking to. But also taboos linked to food and menstruation, for example. And I wondered whether you have some insights into those linkages.
Yes. With regards to general taboos with food and in Madina Zongo, some have to do with rituals, the rituals of preparing food. For some people, you cannot prepare some ritual meal when you are in your menses. But specifically with regards to trotters, so trotters is one ingredient that is not used for so many rituals. For instance, when you come to African traditional religion, my interlocutors suggest that the pig is one animal that is not used widely. I couldn't get any ritual that would permit one to use pig meat or anything that has to do with pig. No. So it usually has to do with a cow, a goat, a chicken. So any other thing but the pork, the pig. So the pig is one animal that is not so much used for a lot of rituals per se. So, but when it comes to girls in their menses, yes, of course, there are so many obstacles when it comes to cooking rituals and more. It cuts across. I think it has to do largely with African indigenous religions. For so many rituals cannot happen when you are in your menses, and one needs to declare that. So that is what I find out from the film.
Thank you. Thank you, Rashida. Jonathan has a question. Rashida, what is the historical reason that trotters are sold in Madina Zongo? Why Madina Zongo in particular?
Okay, so I explained, I think in one of the slides, that there are so many Zongos in Accra. Madina presents a very interesting dynamic in the sense that it is the only Zongo that allows the presence of pig feet. So let me give you an instance. For instance, in Nima Market, Nima is a Zongo, one of the known Zongos, biggest or big Zongos in Accra. So historically, once upon a time, there were trotters there, but people avoided the stalls or the section where the trotters were sold. So they got the people who were selling out of other ingredients out of business because people do not. So over time, people just had to move. So, but Madina presents a fascinating perspective because it is there. And the historical reason is that at the creation of the market, the people who created the market were Muslims. They were more concerned about eradicating issues of thievery and were not concerned about what ingredients were brought into the market. And with the global entanglement with pig feet coming from Europe to Africa or to Ghana specifically, I visited these factories in Europe to understand how it came how to establish this contact. So I got two narratives. One was that the people who came here, who came from Ghana or wherever, at the time they were here, the slaughterhouses did not sell the trotters. It was thrown away. And a convenient way to take it when refrigeration was not so known, maybe 7 decades or even long ago. So it was stored in brine in that barrel and exported. So for a lot of people, it's something that was sent back home to either from the colonial masters or by the Africans themselves. So it's one narration that it's not so clear, because even the companies that have had it and are exporting it for so many decades now are not able to give me a concrete trajectory of how it was moved. So I am also still holding on to this, but I have not closed my research yet. And this is something that is in progress.
Thank you, Rashida. We have, I think, a comment from Charles Prempe. Could it also be because Madina is clearly segmented between Muslims and Christians, such that you clearly have a Christian enclave as well as a Muslim-dominated one? I guess you hardly find these segmentations in the other Zongos in Accra. So the historical formation of Madina that defines clearly religional demarcation could be a reason. Your
yes.
thoughts?
Dr. Prempe is completely right. Yes, this is what happens. So this is one of the factors that has brought about this. And over time, people have joined in the sale of this, and it hasn't been taken out of the market because now there's a government structure that is regulating things in the market. So I agree with Dr. Prempe.
Yeah. In the absence of any other question, I wonder if you have a final comment on the entanglement of really an everyday food ingredient in some quarters, but its entanglement with identity, dress,
Yeah.
and religion, culture, and so many other things. Do you have any final word on that?
Yes. So one final thing that I wish to say is that I think that food is always on the move. So the global entanglement between other continents, bringing people closer, marking identities through food, because there's always some form of exchange. And food is one of those exchanges that happens across the world. It's always on the move. People always change things, eating practices, we learn from each other. So this is one thing that I have seen, or that really marks some identities around the world.
Yeah.
And I think there's one last comment.
Yes. You mentioned Christians in Ghana also avoid trotters. Which denominations and why? And the last one being, how does it create bridges in the market? I suppose the selling of trotters, pig trotters.
Okay. Yeah, so let me start with the last one. It says that how does it create bridges? So the physical or the invisible boundaries. I mentioned techniques of inattention. People pass by there, people avoid places where trotters are sold. So if you're in the lane, unfortunately, and you sell any other commodity, and people do not want to avoid it. And another thing is that Muslims do not give their stalls to people who intend to sell it. And in fact, some Christians who do not eat pig. So there are some of the denominations that do not eat pig. And so that's what someone is mentioning, some of the Christians. So for people who are more inclined towards the Old Testament, they do not eat it. But for those who eat it, it's in fact, for instance, I was told the Jehovah Witness, they eat trotters a lot, pig components, but it's even impossible to speak to them. They don't want to open up on it. So for some Christians, other than the fact that maybe some parts of the Old Testament says do not eat it, some do not eat it for personal reasons, because a pig, it has been seen as a dirty animal. So for some, it's just a personal reason why they don't eat pig, and it may have nothing to do with religion. So these are some of the social issues.
Yes. Thank you very much, Rashida. We will don't go away. We will invite you back at the end of the panel to come and engage again with the audience.
Okay, thank you.
But thank you. I would like to now call our next speaker, Gabeba Baderoon, who we have lent to the US. She's currently at Penn State University in the Department of Women and Gender Studies. Over to you, Gabeba.
Thank you so much, Lebo, and for this panel. I'm very part of it and about the conference as well. I'm going to read some poems as well as a personal essay about food, and I look forward to the discussion. The first piece I'll read is an essay about the place I grew up in and lived in for 28 years, which is called Athlone, a suburb in Cape Town. Finding and growing Athlone. I was born a child of removal, the year after my parents married and the year after they were removed. The victims of forced removals weren't removed to somewhere, only from somewhere. Nothing comes after it. Athlone was where they went after they were removed, and Claremont was where they were from. Athlone was nowhere. In contrast to the fertile soil of their garden in Claremont, the ground here was the grey sand of the Cape Flats, deposited by the sea over the course of 100,000 years. 100,000 years of sand deposited upon the low surface of the sea around islands that are now the Cape Peninsula. This long history gave us soil through which water ran unimpeded, soil without worms, without richness, which kept nothing. A child of this ghost place, I didn't move again for 28 years, living in a single-story house in Crawford for all that time. The house had to grow into itself and not remain the ghost of the place my parents had lost. This took decades. Where exactly is Athlone? Is it in the semi-detached houses of Wokmakiri, or the businesses and houses right next to each other of Belgravia, or the homes around Athlone Stadium, or the new flats overlooking Klipfontein Road, or the scattered double stories of Crawford? Is it the corner cafe, the struggle monument, the roadhouse, the hairdressers, the sound system guys, the auto exhaust shops, the butcher, or the primary schools? Maybe it's the sound of the call to prayer or church bells, or people wearing hats with yellow and white flowers holding hands, and the children walking behind them looking embarrassed to be so dressed up. Or maybe it's the bus stop on Thornton Road at 6:30 on winter mornings, with that lingering nighttime cold rocking from foot to foot, blowing on your hands and stomping on cement as the bus turns in slow motion around the corner of Balthorn Road. Maybe it's the ghost houses that lie beneath the houses you see today. When it's still Durban Road, Klipfontein crosses a railway and the Liesbeek River and draws a line, creating a division that has become almost natural, the distance between the well-off and the poor, between white and black. Mowbray, Athlone and Ower Park, call the taxi guardies. A road divides a place like a river, and never again can you run easily across to the side with a heart. On the weekends, I drive from Stellenbosch, where I'm working for the year, back to my mother's house in Athlone. On Telfel Road, I see that new flats have sprung up in the past year. How beautiful the mountain must be from their windows. I also think of those in the lee of the building, in its shadow, who now look at its walls. On my street, Uncle Paul, whose house is diagonally opposite us, could never forgive the house next door for its shadow. Yes, he had signed the form that gave them permission to build close to the boundary, but ever afterward he lived in its lee. My kitchen never gets the sun anymore, he confided bitterly. That's the kind of thing that matters. Where does the light fall and the shadows? Uncle Paul lived with a shadow until the day he died. Where is Athlone? I have to look on a map to find its edges. Yes, Athlone lies within the boundaries of a map, but it's also all the places people were forced out of and can never return to. I think I've been thinking about this for 18 years. When I started studying at the University of Cape Town, I was trying not to be where I was from, where people shout in the streets, where the accent is flat, flit, flat, as the place. The more educated I became, the more I sounded like I came from nowhere. I left without leaving. When I started to write poetry, I finally recognized that kinetic velocity of shame, of wanting to disappear from where I was. Now I've come back. My brother grows shadows and cold, along with subtle greens, purples, and reds in the backyard of the house he and my mother share. His garden is years in the making. The moss and cement walls cool the heat of this heating planet. His is a garden of preparation, of raking, of making soil out of grey sand, of everything but orange peels in the compost, because the soil is already too acid. Catching the water when the shower is warming up, of smallness, of quiet, of looking. This is his garden of years, of time, of stone and small, moist leaves. After 3 decades, his garden is no longer a prelude. It has tipped into the long middle. On the walls of our house are rakams, 2 Tretytov prints of a glass with droplets of water, a charcoal drawing of me when I was 2. The soundscape of the street is encoded in my mind the way the first thing it sees is imprinted in a gosling's. In the wind, the rattling of a wooden gate. A series of dogs set one another barking at 1 a.m. A car's wheels turning on a gravel driveway. The telephone ringing next door. Soundscape, windscape, mountainscape, intoxicationscape. 2 decades ago, the man opposite us was a merchant, a dealer, a neighborhood supplier. The churches and the mosques in the old neighborhoods are secret architecture left after the cruel religion of apartheid removed their people to Athlone and other suburbs even further away. The people missing those unyielding bones left behind in the places they could never go back to. In those times and now, religion is a secret we leaned on. New names replaced the old. Imam Harun Road over Old Lansdowne Road. Another activist murdered by apartheid. The earth shook at his funeral in protest. The bones of the churches and the mosques remember us in the old places. We leaned on religion and we leaned on beauty. Does anyone see the beauty in poor people's houses? The moldings as perfect as those in churches, flowers in the front yard, neatness tended against great injustice. In the cluster of small tin homes near the Lansdowne post office, one person has made a garden, squeezing a little green into a promise of shelter and permanence. To arrive at a finished landscape takes work. Someone has to do the groundwork, we say, the legwork, the preparation, the clearing of the ground. The word gains its force from the heavy, immovable earth and from labor that is long-term, unglamorous, invisible, and necessary. For the poet Rustam Kuzain, who named his poetry collection and his website with that word, groundwork is reading and writing. When I left Athlone, I missed the food the most. Since then, longing has made me write about it and eventually learn to make it. And through food, I ultimately reached into the ground, the first cleared ground, the garden. In Cape Town, 15 kilometers east on Klipfontein Road, gardens are not just practical or beautiful accessories to the house. They are the reason for imperialism. The company gardens in the center of the city are named for the vegetable rows planted by the slaves and burghers of the Dutch East Indian Company. The Dutch colony at the Cape was established in 1652 to provide fruit, vegetables, and meat and water for ships trading in spices and slaves from the east. Gardens today drive the employment of lowly paid domestic but not quite houseworkers called gardeners. To clear ground and make soil is to envisage a future that you may never see. The temporality of a garden is of a different scale, an order of time that is not background. It requires our attention. It is the present, and it is a deep past. Along the side of my mother's house is an area we call the vegetable patch, but it is by now an urban farm that is all of 30 square meters. It produces tomatoes, carrots, peppers, chilies, squash, lettuce, eggplants, beans, and all kinds of herbs. But it produces it out of soil that has taken 45 years to nourish into fruitfulness. My role 40 years ago, when I was a child and my parents had just moved into this place, was to take vegetable peels out to the compost heap. In this, I was central to the garden, though I didn't know it at the time. We had to learn the stubbornness and refusals of this sand we inherited. It refused grass, it refused roses, though my father tried for years to grow them. My father, who was from Uitenhage in the Eastern Cape, looked after us children while my mother worked as a doctor. And beside being a tailor, he grew vegetables, herbs, bougainvillea, and freesias. But his roses never flourished in this land, in the ancient sand of the Cape Flats. We eventually learned the ground's responsiveness, its long timetable. So we measure our 45 years against 100,000 and learn the timetable of the ground, the timetable of the garden. Groundwork, necessary, invisible, profound, radical, the roots and below the roots. Over the decades, making this garden has made for my family and me a kind of belonging, not only a remembering of what we lost. Who would have thought you would find a garden like this in Athlone? Asked someone at the launch of my first book of poems held at my mother's house. He couldn't imagine the Athlone where I'm from, this dreamscape that escapes all the road signs, this ghost Athlone and this real Athlone. The Athlone we've been growing all these years. Now I'll read some poems. Cinnamon. I fall outside the warm stove of history. Eyes run down my skin like a single finger. I find you open as a tent. You are cinnamon curved around me. Hunger. All day I watch the cooking shows, perhaps for the company of the colors. I have slow apricot memories. I think I see in them a grandmother and a kitchen heavy with years. I think I watch for beginnings, perhaps all beginnings. A girl learning to keep from crying when she slices an onion, when she remembers the country she has left. All day I watch to keep from crying. My tongue softens on the other name. In my mother's backyard, washing snaps above chilies and wild rosemary. Kapokbos, cotton wool bush. My tongue softens on the rosemary's other name. Brinjal, red peppers, and pawpaw grow in the narrow channel between the kitchen and the wall that divides our house from the Severos. At the edge of the grass by the bedrooms, a wit olijf reaches ecstatically for the power lines. In a corner in the lee of the house, nothing grows. Sound falls here. Early in the day, shadows wash over old tiles stacked against the cement wall. In the cold and silence, my brother is making a garden. He clears gravel from the soil and lays it against the back wall. Bright spokes of pincushion proteas puncture a rockery. For hours, he scrapes into a large stone, a hollow, to catch water from a tap that has dripped all my life. Around it, Baderoon slowly reddens the grey sand. A fence made of reed filters the wind between the wall and the house. Ice daisies dip their tufted heads towards its shadows. At night, on an upturned paint tin, he sits in the presence of growing things. Light wells over the rim of a stone basin and collects itself into the moon. Everything is finding its place. And the last couple of ones. Surface. One day in the 90s, we sat around talking after a conference in the mountains, and a white boy asked us to make names for the colors of our skin. A conversation we could only have far from where we lived, in separate parts of the cities. We were hungry for something, not quite this, but still, our wanting made us risk it. Joburg cinnamon, the girl said to begin, and she was the sweet bitter bark of a tree cleaved into history. Athlone coffee, I offered, not admitting Ricoffy, the cheap instant we used in our house. 1 spoon of sugar tapped level against the rim of the bowl, condensed milk not quite mixed in, eddies inside the dark, making the color of my hand as I stirred. South African white, he said, a finger to his chest. Then, pointing to a thinner boy, real white. A confession of beginnings made out of skin. What he wanted to say from the start. It was the first time I admitted to myself I loved the skin of white boys. Him I kissed with my eyes closed in someone else's bed, a brittle pleasure brief as breath. And another who, driving a friend home, reached around the edge of the seat for my hand, and we closed our fingers around each other, hungry, hidden, biding our time till the end. Does it matter there were no names for whiteness, but the whole and the real, back when we tried and failed to make a new country? I see now I always wanted what was furthest from me, a boundary I conjured into flesh that disappeared beneath my fingers. I never resolved the mess of it, the way want is desire and lack at the same time. When I opened my eyes, I told him, bite my shoulder, watching his face as I said it. Yes, hard into his eyes, wanting a little of the hurt to come to the surface and stop. I see I've run out of time, so I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabeba. I don't know whether I'm the only one who closed my eyes and allowed Gabeba's voice to transport me to Athlone, to the Cape Flats, to Table Mountain, and all of that. But wonderful journeys through your childhood, the bad, the good, and so on. I was also fascinated by the entanglements which you conjured up with these beautiful poems and essays in our minds. And in particular, I couldn't help but notice the intersections between land, the body, and food. And that immediately reminded me of the rallying cry of indigenous women in Canada: violence to the body, violence to and through the land. And we can add to that violence through and to food. So thank you very much for a very rich, creative presentation. And I'm not seeing any questions yet, and I think people are still marveling at and thinking, digesting your wonderful presentations. But I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about those entanglements I just mentioned.
Yes, thank you, first of all, Lebi, for those beautiful words. I really feel them, and I thank you for them. I started to write creatively when I was on a fellowship away from South Africa. So I wrote from distance. And that meant, as the keynote speaker earlier said, that the intensity of the memories became much sharper. And also because I was completely an incompetent cook, I really missed the food. I missed home cooked food. So I would be on the phone to my mother and ask her very simple things, how to make dishes. So I was busy with my hands and my memory and my longing at the same time. And I found that this brought things back very strongly. This combination, this entanglement, as you put it so beautifully. So the writing has always been immersed in that desire to be back where I was, even though at the time I was longing to be traveling to exotic places like America. So the contradictions and the paradoxes of leaving and wanting to be back and leaving without leaving, they came to me at that time that I was beginning to write. And with food, I know as well the threat of capitalism coming closer and closer and closer to our bodies is also the threat of displacing our practices of food, which are often the practices of poor people that are very resilient and very important to remember. Because my family remembers not only being removed, but they remember the depression, they remember the rations of World War II. And so they learned how to make food for large families out of very little. And if those skills are lost because of fast foods and the encroachment of McDonald's and other ways of reshaping our conception of eating, I think it'll be a deep loss. So for me, it is both a private sense of desire to retain what is precious and hard earned, and it's also for me a social and political question as well. Also to pay attention to the way beauty is present in people's lives, including in the lives of people whom we only think of with some distant pity almost. But to see actually that there is a great beauty in the presence of people's lives, and this often has to do with gardens and food and care. Well, I see that there's a question from Vasu as well.
Yes. He wants you to comment on your powerful phrase, the kinetic velocity of shame.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, if you listen to my voice, I don't know what you can hear, but when I listen to my voice, I hear somebody who ran away from where she actually was, who ran away from who she was, and what she was. Because I started to speak like this long before I left South Africa. You know, you might explain, yeah, she sounds like that because she studied elsewhere or she lives elsewhere. But actually, I started to sound like this when I was 8 or 9 as a child, because I understood as a child that the way you sounded when you sounded black or when you sounded like you're from Athlone was somebody who didn't exist, somebody who didn't matter. And so I tried to sound like somebody who mattered, which meant that I tried to sound like somebody who wasn't me, who wasn't from where I was. And so my voice, it captures for me a sense of loss. And I know what I've lost because my family are people who didn't run away, who didn't leave before leaving. They sound like they are from the places they are. And that is, you know, I can't make the same jokes in the same way. I can't, even now that I want to, I can't sound the same way I want to sound, that I abandoned and rejected and left behind. So that kinetic velocity of shame is the speed with which I left, you know, the history of leaving, and how I recognize now that it has to do with deep private emotions that are also deeply political emotions, that are a heritage of slavery, that are a heritage of colonialism and apartheid. And, you know, how that is present in my own body and my own history and my own mind is part of that phrase, I think.
Yeah. Is it perhaps linked to those of us with family members who passed during apartheid? Do you think it's linked to that? Is this part of the shame, or were they like practical? Was it for practical reasons?
That's an excellent question. You know, the one person in my family who escaped in a way was my uncle, who went to England when he was 17. And so when we spoke to him on the phone, I could hear he sounded English. So I think that was who I was trying to sound like. But the people who passed it was so interesting. They were there, not there, because it was important for them not to be seen to connect with us. And so, but there was also a practical matter. You know, my uncle who is very light-skinned with green eyes, he would go to Durban and pass for white there in the building industry. And because he would earn more money, and then he would come to Cape Town and he would be an ordinary Muslim man. And so there were practical elements, and then there were elements of shame and disappearance. And, you know, poor people had to make practical decisions sometimes. So I would say, I will never pass for white. I'll never pretend to be white. But now I'm the person who inherited what my mother's family, who came out of the Depression and the war, did for me. And, you know, my mother is a miracle. She went to university in the 1950s, and she, as a poor child, you know, by then she had obviously grown to 18, but as a child of poor people, working class people, and she became a doctor, and she lifted her whole family into the middle class, you know, not just her own immediate family. So I understand the practicality of poor people differently. You know, I honor it.
Yes. Thank you very much. We seem to be out of time, but Yvette says, wow, I was born around the corner from your house. You make it come alive. The point about where we are possibly removed to, a deep one. And Rishan mentioned soundscapes as voice too. So thank you very much, Gabeba. We'll invite you back at the end of this panel. And now I have the pleasure to call to the stage Rini Singh from Rhode Island School of Design. Over to you, Rini.
Hi, I'm just going to share my presentation. Um, I think it's a good segue from Habiba's because I'm also writing from distance, and I'm talking about Rajasthan's food culture and its link to sustainability. So before I begin, I have to specify that Rajasthan is a state in northwestern part of India, which is a desert state. And when we talk about sustainability, especially in this context, it I have to define what it means in this context. So I have used a framework of three F's to define sustainability, which is finitude, fragility, and fairness. So finitude basically means that the resources on the planet are limited. Fragility translates to how systems, be it ecosystems or human systems, are vulnerable to shocks. And because of the coexistence of finitude and fragility, there comes a question of fairness. Who gets to access what resources? And I think it's really important to talk about food cultures within this framework. And for that purpose, I had to introduce a fourth F, which was food sovereignty, which basically is deeply linked to self reliance and the right of people to define their own food and agriculture, to protect and regulate domestic agriculture and trade, and to achieve sustainable development objectives. So, primarily, I'm trying to talk about Rajasthan's food culture within the framework of these four F's. And I think it is really important to study the desert food culture, not only because it originates from the lack, but because now is the time to maybe imagine alternate food systems. And maybe one place to look for it can be in the past. The, I mean, also, a lot of recent researches have been based on the fact that we still face issues of malnutrition, nutritional security, and loss of biodiversity. So, through this talk, I'm trying to focus on a plant species in Rajasthan called Prosopis cinerea or khejri in Rajasthan, and linking it to food culture and sustainability. So, before I talk about the food aspects of it, I think it's really important to lay down a few characteristics of khejri. So, khejri is a xerophytic plant with roots that can go up to 20 meters or extraordinary lengths to look for water. I mean, it has gone up to 53 meters or more. And as a leguminous plant, it fixes nitrogen, which enables soil health and the health of other plants. It is also farmers grow it with other plants because of its deeper root, it doesn't compete with other plants for moisture, and it also gives those plants nitrogen. So it sort of breaks down this idea that a lot of plants can't be grown together, or a tree and a plant can't be grown together. And one of the most important aspects of native plants are that they're linked to biodiversity. And in this case, because khejri is grown out of a desert, they grow and thrive without high input or investment in capital. And that quality of khejri makes it a safe bet for farmers as a sustainable source of income, even in the time of drought. When it comes to the environmental conditions, the ecological importance, and somewhere talking about the socio-economic importance of it. But when it comes to human consumption or food, uh, you see here the ripe pods of khejri are called sangri ki fali, and they can be eaten ripe as it is. But one of the most common practices in Rajasthan is to boil those pods and dry them to use throughout the year. One of the most famous Rajasthani meals is called pachkuta, which translates to five ingredients. And sangri is one of the prominent ingredients in in that particular dish, which is actually made up of 5 native ingredients. So, as a protein-rich sauce, the way that it has been used, it has been dried and can be stored over more than a year. And these sort of ingenious techniques to use a particular plant in varied ways throughout the year has made sangri as an ingredient a mainstay during drought months when nothing or like little else was available. It was also believed in past research that the bark of the tree used as flour during famine months. For and the leaves of the trees are highly relished by animals, which were also a mainstay for farmers who practiced animal husbandry. And the most important part of why khejdi is so important to communities is what I'm going to tell you next is a story of interconnectedness and maybe one of the first movements in the history of environmentalism in India. Rajasthan was and still is home to Bishnoi community, which was founded by Jamboji. In this particular community, Jamboji laid down 29 principles which were fundamental to the sect of Bishnoi community, out of which 8 principles prescribed preservation of biodiversity and it also encouraged animal husbandry. A lot of inhabitants of this community lived in a village called Khejarli. So the name Khejarli is also derived from Khejri, and it is called Khejarli because it had a forest which was full of Khejri trees, and there was a place where the Bishnoi community lived. At that time, in 1730 AD, the Maharaja or the king of Jodhpur, Maharaja Abhay Singh, sent his army out to cut the whole forest for raw materials to make his own palace. So he needed raw materials to make his own palace. And during that time, when his army started to log the Bishnoi forest, the members of the community staged a non-violent protest using their bodies as shield to hug and protect the trees. And this movement was led by Amrita Devi, who was a woman who was trying to hug the trees and save them, but she was killed by the army men, and the 363 people who followed her to save the trees were also killed. This movement inspired the really famous Chipko movement. And I believe that when communities are intrinsically linked to nature, they fight to preserve it. Even today in Rajasthan, I grew up in Rajasthan and I celebrated this festival almost every year, a festival called Shitla Ashtami, where women pray and everyone in the family eats stale cold food, which and sangri or pachkuta is something that everybody eats because you don't need a refrigerator to store that and it tastes as good even the next day. So in that particular festival, it's believed that um, this festival is celebrated on the onset of summer months. So it's believed that when the body transitions from winter to summer, you need to equip yourself, you need to equip your body to prevent heat-borne diseases. And that's why you need to pause and eat cold food. Um, I think at the intersection of the 3 F's that we're talking about, it's really important to come back and think about how it is linked to communities, ecosystem, and social justice. So I think when I look at the intersection of finitude, fragility, fairness, and food sovereignty, it's important to highlight that alternate foods are really important for the biodiversity of our planet and diversity in our diets because all these staple ingredients also are overused, overexploited, and leads to monoculture. When we talk about fragility and I we think of soil as a dynamic socio-ecological system, which is affected by interaction with society and ecology. Growing native plants uh, takes on less shock for soil. It's because the plants are meant, native crops are meant to grow in a particular ecosystem. And native ingredients provide cushion to both societal shocks and shocks of the ecosystem. But because families that have been growing in a particular region are linked to native crops in terms of festivals that are placed around it and in terms of techniques on how to cook them. And that's what leads to fairness, actually. When I think about fairness, I usually think about the fact that how there is a huge disparity between the rich and the poor, but also between ecosystems in general, between animals, non-human elements, and plants and humans. And when an ingredient is linked to festivals, it's celebrated irrespective of where you come from. And of course, it also builds food sovereignty because people grow what they have been growing for the longest time. But this might seem like an oversimplification of sustainability. But I think it's a step forward in a direction which talks about all of these aspects and how food, any native sort of food, is linked to sustainability. Hello? Hi. I think I, yeah.
Oh, have you finished? We were still listening very attentively to your very important work, and again pointing us to the links between land and the food and social justice or fairness. And the question I kept asking myself is, how do, particularly in communities that are struggling in terms of food, access to food and land, can we have a balance between food justice while at the same time paying attention to sustainability?
I think, like I mentioned, it's really um, a simplified process, which is difficult to implement. But
Mm,
if we look at all these three aspects, I think it is something that is achievable for sure. And
yeah.
I think when I was listening to Habiba, she also mentioned that this particular loss and how people have been um, using resources to feed a large amount of to feed a large number of people, even when they had little. I think these are skills that need to be saved, and
Mm,
we have to think about ways on how to save them, but they can very well coexist.
yes. And there's a question from Vasu. Thank you. Powerful insights into um, the culture.
Yeah.
I'm interested in Amrita Devi Bishnoi and her sacrifice for the protection of Gejri trees.
Yes.
Tell us more about that if you can.
So the Bishnoi community was intrinsically linked to the ecosystem because their principles, I mean, out of the 29 principles, 8 principles were directed towards saving biodiversity and encouraging animal husbandry. And especially in a desert, when you find something that you can actually use as a resource, it is not a relationship where you just take things. It is a give and take relationship. So, through the story of Amrita Devi, the Khejdi forest where the Bishnoi community lived was really important for them because it sort of gave them fodder, it gave them food, it actually gave them shelter and all the raw materials that they needed. So, it was intrinsically linked to their community and their lives as well, and their livelihoods for that matter. So, when the Maharaja of Jodhpur sent an army to log the trees, everybody came forward and hugged the trees. And Amrita Devi was the one who sort of started this movement. Uh, and they were killed. I mean, they valued the trees more than their own lives. Which, I mean, it's pretty historic to think about all of these things. But um, what followed then was actually the Maharaja, when he got to know about this, he declared the site as a preserve. So now, even today, nobody's allowed to go and cut trees in that site. So that was a monumental change in the mindset, and I think that's really inspirational.
Yes. A question from your fellow panelist, Gabeba. Can you speak about creativity, narrative, and affect, along with questions of resilience and sustainability?
That's a great question, and I think I'm studying at Rhode Island, and I Rhode Island School of Design, and what I'm looking at is also how storytelling can move people. So, be it like Habiba's poems that she recited, you are left feeling something, and when you are left feeling something, I think it just moves apart in people where they really want to act for change. So this when I tell this story about Kejri tree and how festivals are deeply linked to it, there is a common element that people find linked to. So even if I tell this particular story or narrative to anybody in America, maybe they find some sort of linkage or commonality. And I think that leads to, and I think maybe sustainability should also have storytelling as a factor, because it empowers people to take some sort of it empowers people to take some action when it comes to talking about resilience and how important it is, it was for older communities as well.
Yeah. Let's see. Jonathan is asking whether you could describe the flavor of the cherry.
Kejri, yeah.
Kejri. Sorry.
So it actually, the ripe pods taste like any green beans that you have, but what's but the dried pods, I think, have an umami flavor, like maybe some kind of mushroom. So as you saw in the picture, the dried pods are really thin, and they look almost like a thin slice of mushroom, and they taste very meaty and almost like a dried vegetable. And I mean, as you put with them with spices, it just enhances the taste. So it kind of tastes like not mushroom. I wouldn't say mushroom, but a dried version of mushroom.
Yum. I wonder if there are any more questions specifically for Rini, or whether we should invite the rest of the panel back to the stage so that we can have a combined discussion. Can you come back to the stage, Gabeba and Rashida?
It would be a pleasure. Thank you, Rini. That was really inspiring.
Thank you.
Indeed. Indeed. Rashida, did we lose you? Anyway, could we have comments, questions for the entire panel now combined? And there's nothing preventing you from having a conversation between the two of you. I don't know whether Rashida will be able to rejoin.
Rini, may I ask, with curiosity, because I was complaining about capitalism, but I wonder if there was a role for exporting the kedgeree elsewhere, or it could be a form of agriculture that is not just sustaining for the people within Rajasthan, but for instance, that it could, and I don't think about it in terms of it becoming a very expensive superfood in health food stores, but actually, especially among South-South exchanges of agriculture, where, we could perhaps between farmers and other poor people, but exchanging these sustaining foods that, could make such a difference. So I wonder if that is a viability.
I mean, of course, that's a great idea, because then farmers will be motivated to grow these crops as well. But in my sort of research, I've spoken to a few farmers in Rajasthan, and I got to know that they just grow these native ingredients for um, their own use, because the market that the value that they get in the market is not high, because everybody wants a broccoli in Rajasthan, but they don't want um, sangri. And I think that's one of the major sort of something that hampers farmers to grow these crops. But now I think it's coming back slowly, because people realize how important it is to eat something that grows, I don't know, 2 kilometers away from you. So,
Yes,
yeah,
I see that.
I think,
I'm wondering.
Go
sorry.
ahead, Habiba.
I'm so sorry. No, I was just wondering if your idea about stories could help to change the perception of Kidgeri.
Yes.
So often it is the story of, say, Amazonian berries or of Mexican corn that suddenly turns it into a superfood and a highly desirable food, like rooibos tea in South Africa. That was always the poorer cousin of the Ceylon tea, and then it became a superfood
Yeah.
and became very expensive. So, although fortunately they are still cheap rooibos brands, but so I'm wondering if this the narrativation, but not following that model of making it too expensive for people who grow it to actually eat it anymore, which has happened in Mexico, for instance. So,
I think it's sort of difficult to find that balance, because what it ends up is actually getting into capitalism all over again. And I think that's some sort of balance that I struggle to find, because when I think about solutions, this is the easiest one, and the way that I can use narrative to sell it here in the US, but how to not capitalize on somebody else's product. And I find that I find my I find that I'm a middleman, and benefit far more. I might benefit far more than people who are growing it. So sort of to think about how that could be translated is, of course, an interesting question for sure. But I will think about it, maybe more creatively.
Okay, a question from Vasu for you, Rini, is Amrita Devi revered as a goddess?
In the Bishnoi community, yes, but in all of Rajasthan, no. This story about Amrita Devi is something that people found out about recently. But because Chipko movement, which is a similar movement on a grand scale, was something that was famous all around India, but nobody knew how Amrita Devi's movement was followed. Amrita Devi movement was preceded by the Chipko movement. So I think um, in the community, yes, but not all over the country or Rajasthan.
Thank you for that. For you, Habiba, from Ben, thinking Athlone and food and capitalism. Do you have any comments, memories you might share on Wembley Roadhouse or the Wembley Group of Companies?
Indeed. Oh, yeah. I whenever I bring guests to visit, I always take them to the Roadhouse. You don't even have to say which Roadhouse. There's really just one.
The Roadhouse.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Wembley. And I learned from my friend Angelo Fick to circulate money in the Black economy as much as possible, because so much of our money, goes immediately to the glamorous centers of the city where Black people were excluded from. And so we often don't support local businesses. So I try to do that as much as possible, where I get my spectacles, where I go to the doctor. And that's the Wembley is a little small conglomerate now in Athlone. It is the taste of the food in Wembley Roadhouse that I, of course, remember. Although my family was not well off enough to eat out very often. So it was always a special occasion when we went to the Roadhouse. And I still do it, as I mentioned, especially when visitors are there. But my family focused really more on eating in the house because it was cheaper, and also because we had great cooks in the house. So one of the things my sister would do, for instance, is reproduce the food that you could get at the Roadhouse and at Kentucky Fried Chicken, but she would make it in the house. And one of the best things about fast food in Cape Town actually is the quality of the fast food. So when I first tasted McDonald's, I thought, oh, this is the most appalling, cheap, tasteless food, because my knowledge of fast food was built on Cape Town fast food, especially in the Black areas, which is excellent fast food. This is award-winning fast food. So there are elements of the homegrown economy that has grown up, including in the segregated areas post-removal, that are to be treasured. And I do think we should be thoughtful about how we participate in capitalism. And one of the ways we can do that is by eating more of what we grow, as Rini's example shows us, and then making sure that we are sustaining the local economies, the Black economies, when we can. It's not always possible, I know, because sometimes it's more expensive to buy from a local shop than going into the big supermarkets, but where we can, to nourish one another, I think.
Welcome, Rashida. We're just having a combined conversation among the four of us, really among the three of you. But if you could mute when you are not talking, so there's a slight echo in the background. So if you could mute your mic when you are not speaking, that would be great. I don't see any further questions or comments from the audience, unless the three of you would like to maybe say something. I'm always at the end of each presentation saying to myself, I wish I had said that.
If it's possible, I would love to ask Rashida a question about, I have some friends who are secular Muslims, and the last boundary always seems to be, will you eat a ham sandwich? Or, it's it's like, as a Muslim, that's the idea, that the biggest boundary. And so I wonder how you approach this in your body, in your body coming close to utterly forbidden, and whether it also felt for you like the frontier that had most meaning and that was most anxiety producing in even coming close. I wondered how it felt to you as a researcher.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think that in the beginning, I wanted to pass by it. I didn't intend to work on it because of my orientation. So I realized that there was no escape. This is something that had come up in the ethnographic work, and a lot of people were interested in it. As much as I was talking or discussing about food, this is food, even though it's that boundary that I don't want to go to. So before I started work on it, I had to psych myself. Yes, I am doing this because, not because I am trespassing, but I'm doing this just to get some information about it. And indeed, the first day it was quite strong on me because of the brine. This was my first encounter. And because when my own sister found out that this is what I went to do, she asked me to wait and I should take my bath outside. I shouldn't come. And my mom, she was like, "Are you aware this is what she's doing?" So it was a big deal. Like it was accept this. So indeed, I did not intend to eat, or I just interested in the lives of the people who sold it, the people who were termed in disgusting for selling this. And indeed, you are right. The trotter actually has a strong, perhaps because of the brine. And when I went to the factory, I found out that there are immigrants, Muslim immigrants in Europe, and that's where they work. So for them, they need to feed the family. They don't eat it. They just work. They just package it. That's their explanation. So for the moment that they're in the factory, they assume that they don't know what they are packaging. It's meat. So that's why I mentioned techniques of inattention. Like, let me mute myself and make the money. So, and they use the Islamic principle also of darura, which is the principle of necessity, that one needs to feed the family or one needs to eat. One is not ingesting it. And in fact, the Quran and Hadith doesn't tell you how you cleanse yourself when you're in contact with these things. It doesn't say that you need to go through this process of cleansing. Unlike other fluids, when you come into contact with other fluids that are termed impure or contaminated. But in my case, I because a colleague of mine told me, okay, you need to perform ghusl. Ghusl is ritual cleansing, like bath. But there was none. I could not find any. At some point, I was interested. And yes, there was a publication that I had to go back and involve my interlocutors. And that one also got me so close to them because they have a challenge, an identity struggle of selling pork in the market and living in a Muslim-dominated compound where they share spaces. So today they don't make, for some people, they don't make their trade known because they want to be able to share utensils, to share some common space. So there's some identity struggle. Okay, at the market, I'm a trotter seller. But when I get home, I just sell meat. And meat is ambiguous. Meat could be anything. So these are the struggles. So in other parts of my work thesis, I highlight the struggles of these sellers. They have double identities. So yes, I hope I answered you. Yeah.
I'm muted. There's a question for Rini. Can you see the question, or should I read it to you? From Vanessa.
No more questions?
I can see it.
Yeah, I don't see it too.
Can you answer, Rini?
Yes, I'm just reading it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I think she's sort of asking me about my thoughts on food sovereignty and climate change, and how the rediscovery of indigenous food has led to monoculture, which I think, which is what Habiba was mentioning, which happened in Mexico, I think. And that's why what I think the reason that I think that it's difficult to find a balance is because there is no balance. You have to eat what grows next to you. Just that's it. It has to be, and food sovereignty. That's why it um, talks more about localization than anything else. It talks about decentralization and and not capitalism, because it doesn't ask you to grow for anybody else. It just asks you to grow for yourself and for your community. So, of course, I mean, that's a great question because that's something that I constantly think about. And now when I see big food companies also focusing on regenerative agriculture as this term, which I mean, the definition is quite skewed because you can't think about regenerative agriculture and think about selling the product all over the world. So there's this weird imbalance and paradox between these terms. So I think what food sovereignty and climate change really has in common is the fact that you have to think local. And if thinking local is something that you can do, and if you sitting in Rajasthan don't want to eat an avocado, you have to be okay with that. I think that's yeah, that's the most important thing that I think that I've analyzed.
More questions or comments from the three of you or from the audience?
I want to ask Viva a question, and I think it is based on narratives for sure. But before I came to Rhode Island School of Design, I was working for an Indian food publication, and all the stories that I've read about indigenous food or local food in India l- always left me so inspired. And I wonder if poems do that. I mean, I know they do because when I hear about cinnamon or hunger, I just feel like I'm there, and I feel like a cinnamon. I don't know. There's so many cracks of it that I feel that it's right here next to me, and I feel it more than I will actually feel a cinnamon when I take it in my hands.
Yes.
I wonder how to think about that when I'm working. So I think that's how people, that's how at least I relate to it so much more, and it engages me so much more than anything else.
Yes.
So any advice?
I completely agree with you that one actually feels it more than touching the cinnamon itself. And I think that's a very powerful lesson. I think in the academy, we have grown used to writing in a way that deliberately depersonalizes and that almost requires the removal of that sense of layering. But I've heard a wonderful workshop on writing by the Kenyan scholar Kaguro Masharia, and he said, ask the question, what do you want the reader to do? Not how can I be as clever as possible in writing this? It is, think about the relation you are establishing with the reader. And if you want the reader to feel that resonance, if you want the reader to perform an action, to not buy an avocado or almonds because they take so much water, then write toward that goal. And that set me free a little bit from the impersonal, dry, static writing that I thought was required of me in the academy. And the other thing is that I started to write poetry alongside, as a hobby, as an extramural activity, my academic work while I was doing my PhD. And it was really interesting that I would go into the one when the other was not satisfying me, or where I was stuck or struggling. So a different kind of writing, I think, is a very useful practice, even for those of us who have finished our PhDs, but certainly for those of us who are still struggling. Keeping a journal, reflecting on the contradictions or the places where you really find that boundary, like Rashida was saying. It's a very fascinating place when there are when there are limits, when there are places where you are stuck, they're fascinating places to deal with in other forms of writing. And lastly, I find your stories, Rini, really wonderful, and I hope both that there will be space for them within your academic writing, but if not, then that you will write other kinds of pieces about this, because I think it will cause a new relation for the reader in reading your work. And as you know, that could change the world. It really does.
Hopefully.
Yes.
Thank you to the three of you. We have about 2 minutes to, do any of you have any last word to share with the audience before we close? Any words of wisdom?
I recommend that everybody, including the worst cooks, learn to make something that you love to eat. Especially those of us who had to leave home to go study, like all three of us, that learn to make something and it'll last for you for the rest of your life.
That's a good advice. I can agree.
Yeah.
I can agree, because one needs to eat.
Yeah.
Yes, and it's
And
so
one needs
frequent and
to
regular
stay.
that you need to find something at every point in time.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a
And you
good
need to
advice.
stay connected.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking the three wonderful speakers for this panel. We walk away really enriched and thinking deeply about the issues that you have raised, and we hope that you will continue to engage us throughout these 3 days. Thank you very much for your presentations.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think we are done.
And the applause from the audience.